In this lesson, we're going to talk about deflation. We're going to define deflation, talk about its causes, its consequences, and some of the solutions to the types of deflation that might have negative consequences for society as a whole. Let's start with the definition. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. At this point, you've probably watched some lessons or studied inflation, which is defined as an increase in the average price level of goods and services in a nation over time. Deflation has just the opposite definition. This is a decrease in the average price level of a nation's goods and services over time. Prices are falling. Again, to distinguish this from a microeconomic concept of a lower price, we're not talking about the price for a particular good or service, rather the average price level. So how do we measure deflation? We use the Consumer Price Index, which is the same tool we use to measure inflation. So this would be a decrease in the CPI between two time periods. In a previous lesson, I showed how the CPI could be used to actually calculate a nation's inflation rate. If the inflation rate turned out to be negative, then that nation would be experiencing deflation. So let's talk about the demand factors that could cause a nation to experience deflation. Obviously, if there's a decrease in aggregate demand in a nation, there will be downward pressure on prices. Now, this doesn't mean that there will immediately be deflation. So at first, a country might experience disinflation. Disinflation is distinct from deflation because it is not a negative inflation rate, rather it is a decrease in the inflation rate from a higher level to a level closer to zero but not negative. After a nation has experienced disinflation, if aggregate demand remains weak, that nation might begin experiencing deflation. Let's do some graphical analysis now to illustrate how demand factors could cause a nation to experience disinflation and deflation. We'll use our aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, which by now should be very familiar to you. Let's assume an economy is in equilibrium at its full employment level of output. In other words, aggregate demand crosses short-run aggregate supply at the full employment level. What could cause this economy to go from experiencing price level stability at a low and stable inflation rate corresponding with full employment? We'll put PLE here. And you may have learned that the desired target inflation rate is between 2% and 3% inflation. So when an economy is producing at its full employment level, it's normal to have an inflation rate of between 2 and 3%. Assume that aggregate demand decreases in this economy now. Many factors could account for a decrease in aggregate demand. We'll just assume that there was an increase in the value of this country's currency, causing net exports to fall and aggregate demand to decrease to AD1. How will this lead to deflation? Well, clearly we see that less demand for the nation's goods in the short run causes a decrease in output to Y1 and a decrease in the average price level to PL1. Is this deflation? It might be if aggregate demand fell by a lot, but it might also just be disinflation. A lower inflation rate means that goods are still going up in price. However, they're going up more slowly than they were when the economy was at full employment. So how could this economy go from disinflation to deflation? There's a couple possibilities here. If the rise in unemployment accompanying this recessionary gap, as we call this here, cause incomes to fall, then consumption might fall as well, and this economy could experience an even further decrease in aggregate demand to AD2. A further decrease in AD might push this economy into deflation and an even deeper recession, as we see here, as output falls to Y2. Alternatively, this economy could go from the short run to the long run. Wages could become flexible, and the downward pressure on wages might move this economy from disinflation into deflation. As we've now explained in several lessons, as wages adjust to the lower level of demand, aggregate supply will shift out to SRAS1, and this could contribute to the deflation in the economy arising from the weak aggregate demand. So we might see the average price level fall to PL3. Now, this helps the economy recover from its demand deficient recession as lower costs of production incentivize firms to hire more workers, and output starts to return closer to its full employment level. As here we see we've gone from Y2 back to Y1. This downward flexibility of wages might be the economy's way of self-correcting, but it could also lead to deflation. So as we've seen in our graph on the right, a decrease in aggregate demand causes what we call demand deficient deflation. This is when prices fall as a result of a recession. Weak aggregate demand puts downward pressure on prices. First disinflation, then deflation. And we've already shown how aggregate supply can change to cause deflation as well. Lower costs of production, including lower wages, lower rents, or interest rates, allow firms to sell their output at a lower price level. When aggregate supply shifts out, short-run aggregate supply shifts out. That's an increase. Deflation results. Which of these types of deflation, those caused by decreases in aggregate demand or those caused by increases in aggregate supply, is more harmful for a nation? It's no surprise that falling demand, in other words, demand deficient deflation, is worse than the deflation that accompanies an increase in aggregate supply, because it is accompanied by falling employment and falling output.
Here we go.